The last day of a meeting is always sad for me because I get to know you guys, and I like to imagine what it would be like to be part of this family, and that's always a fun thing to think about. I guess the church is always like that. Wherever you are, you get to know the people, and as soon as you get to know people, it's time to leave. It's kind of sad. Open your Bibles to Judges chapter 13. Actually, if you'd like an outline of our text, we're just going to be walking through Judges 13, 14, 15, and 16. 4 chapters. Now, Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 7, I think is a good way to start this lesson. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 7 says this, "And I brought you into a plentiful land," God says to the Israelites, "to enjoy its fruit and its good things. But when you came in, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination." That's why you have the judges. The judges are in many ways a condemnation of the Israelites, and you find that in their character. Sometimes the characters that God uses as judges of the land are a rebuke of the people themselves. Today, we're going to look at Samson. He's the last of the characters that I've chosen to look at. And after we walk through these 4 chapters of Samson, I'm going to give you 5 lessons. 5 lessons that I think are very practical and meaningful. At least they are to me. Now, bear in mind that the judges as a whole, they are deliverers. And we need to remember that God picked, at least most of the time, very unlikely people to serve as judges of the land to deliver the Israelites. And there's a lesson there for us if we will hear it. He's teaching us something. Samson is an unlikely man. He's a wild man. But he typifies what is true about a lot of people in Israel at this time. Follow me. I can deliver you with anyone, God says. God says, one man on my side is going to seem like the majority, and we will win. So we open our Bibles to Judges chapter 13. In Judges 13, just a few verses in, an angel comes to Manoah's wife and says to her, "You're going to have a baby." And of course she was amazed by this, but her baby, according to the angel, was supposed to be a Nazirite. Now, someone who was under a Nazirite vow was to have no alcohol. He was to not let any razor touch his head, and he was not to come in contact with a dead body. Of course, he's going to violate all of these vows as he goes on in his life. But Manoah's wife runs to her husband and says, "I saw an angel." Well, what did he say? "I'm going to have a baby." Well, Manoah, in verse 8, he prays to the Lord, saying, "Please send this angel back that we might know how to raise this boy." I suppose a lot of parents have prayed prayers like that when they're about to have their first child. We don't know what we're doing. We don't know where we're going to be going with this. I know that feeling. I've had 3 children. It's amazing how in the hospital, those people in the hospital, they'll just send you home with a new baby. No instruction manual. They make sure to send you home with a bill, but no instructions about what to do with this baby. Now, whatever feeling you feel with a brand new child, double that with Manoah, because this baby is going to be born miraculously. Samson's born, and chapter 13 leaves us with him growing into a young man. And in fact, the chapter ends this way in verse 25. "And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahanadan between Zorah and Ashtaol." By the way, I don't exactly know what that means. I don't know if what that means is if by the point he reaches the age of a young man, he starts realizing he has supernatural strength. I don't know, but it appears what's going on here is that God is taking a typical Israelite whose faith is very small, who is compromising on all parts of God's law. Really, he's not worth much at all. And he gives them this talent, this supernatural talent. Now, I don't know if this is a good illustration of Samson, but as a teenager, I remember one of the trustees of the school that I attended. He was a very wealthy man, and incidentally also a very busy man. He had one son about my age, and to justify, I suppose, not really being present in his son's life, he would buy his son just about anything he wanted. One day I saw his son driving a brand new Corvette. I mean, you know what that is. It's a race car. It's a muscle car. What his dad had was money. What he didn't have was time. And giving a boy a race car without being present in his life, is that a blessing or is that a curse? It's one thing to have a wild boy, but to turn around and give him a fast car hardly makes any sense. Now, by the way, this really isn't a perfect illustration because God isn't like that dad. God has time. God was governing Samson's life. But it does illustrate the fact that Samson is a wild man with no scruples. His parents, as we're going to see, they are pushovers. His parents are not going to govern him well. He's going to grow up with desires that are bent on gratifying the here and now. Now, God didn't make Samson that way, but what you are going to see is God is going to take Samson, give him supernatural strength, and he's going to aim him at the Philistines. That's the best I know how to contextualize what we're about to read with Samson. Now we come to chapter 14. I don't know Samson's age by the time we come to chapter 14, but he's a man who's old enough to really start noticing women. So he goes to this land by the name of Timnath. It's the heart of Philistine territory. These are pagan, idolatrous, wicked people. These are people, the very same people that God commanded the Israelites, I want you to drive these people out of the land. Don't let anyone remain. I will fight right beside you and you will be victorious if you do it. But they don't. They let these people remain. And so verse 1 says that he sees a woman, Canaanite, a Philistine, and she's beautiful. And so he goes back to his parents and says to them, I want you to get this woman for me. She's beautiful. I want you to make sure she marries me. I want her. And they say, don't you think that it would be better for you to get a wife among our people, maybe an Israelite? And Samson, he shuts that suggestion down really quick. I told you to get her for me. And I can tell you right now, if that was my son, I wouldn't have gone to that wedding. Not even if Samson were my own son, I wouldn't have gone. This is a direct violation of God's express law. God told the Israelites in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 2, when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You must make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. Could God have been any more clear about this? Don't marry her. But Samson says, but I want her. So Samson's parents, they go to Timnath and they start making arrangements for their son, preparing for the wedding. And on one of these trips, Samson is alone and he's attacked by a lion. Perhaps this is the first time at this moment that Samson really realizes he's got this supernatural strength. Verse 6 says that he tears that lion limb from limb with his bare hands. How do you like that? I don't know who was more surprised, Samson or the lion. And what happens when you take a wild man who's used to getting everything he wants and you give him supernatural strength? I'll tell you what you better do. You better buckle your seatbelt. While the wedding ceremony arrangements are underway, Samson passes that lion again many days later, and there's that carcass. I suppose that it had been picked through by the animals and it would be reduced to bones now. And some bees had taken up residence, I suppose, in the rib cage, and they were producing a honeycomb. Well, what Samson does is he just scoops up some of that honeycomb and brings it to his parents. Okay, so the wedding feast is now here, and it's lasting several days, and Samson marries this Philistine woman from Timnath. And some friends come, Philistine friends. And there's about 30 Philistine boys that surround Samson, and on a whim, Samson says to them, I've got a riddle for you. If you can solve it, I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And if you can't solve it, you've got to give the same to me. And so here's the riddle in verse 14. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the straw came something sweet. Well, what's the answer to that riddle? Well, you know the answer because I just explained it to you. But they don't know what that is. It's a very difficult riddle. And Samson only gave them 7 days to figure it out. By day 3, the men start getting kind of upset. They start thinking to themselves, we didn't come to this feast to give Samson the shirts off our backs. And so they go to Samson's Philistine wife and they say, you're going to tell us the answer to this riddle, or we're going to execute you and your father. So this becomes a very serious predicament they're in. So she goes to her husband and she begins to cry, you didn't tell me the secret. You didn't even tell my parents. And she keeps pressing him, and he caves and tells her it's a lion. And there's honey in the carcass of the lion. And here's what happened. And he tells her the story about where that riddle came from. And so they go to Samson, the 30 Philistine men, and she told them the answer, and they tell him the answer to the riddle. Here it is. And this is what Samson says, verse 18. This is what he says to them. If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. Which, by the way, doesn't really sound very complimentary. So the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, the text says, and he goes and kills 30 Philistines, takes their clothes and gives it to the 30 Philistines with whom he had gambled. And then he storms off because he's mad that his wife told him the answer. And that's chapter 14. We come to chapter 15. Before long, Samson starts missing his wife. Remember, he stormed off. He was mad. And he comes back and gives her the gift of a young goat. You know, that always gets them. The goat will get you out of any marriage problem. And he gets there. And right before he walks into the bedroom, her dad stops him and says, oh, no, Samson. She's with someone else. You stormed off, so I gave her to someone else. Tell you what, I've got this other daughter. She's much better. Now, by the way, these are pagan people. This is how they operate. Samson hears all of this, and he's furious. So mad that he catches, I'm just going off of the text, he catches 300 foxes, ties a torch between the pair of them, and releases them into the Philistine fields, and he probably destroys millions of dollars worth of produce. The Philistines, they are furious about what has happened to their crop. And so they find Samson's wife and father-in-law and execute them and burn them. And when Samson hears about this, things just escalate even more. The New American Standard Bible says in verse 8 that he struck them ruthlessly with a mighty slaughter. Here's a man, he's just going crazy. Now bear in mind, in all of this, he's delivering Israel. It's remarkable how God has chosen to do it this time. He's giving remarkable strength to a man who typifies the problem of Israel. So the Philistines, they then go to Judah and attack one of the cities of the Israelites. You see how it's just escalating thing after thing? They start attacking the cities of the Israelites. And so the men of Judah ask, why are you attacking us? What did we do to you? And so the Philistines say, well, we're attacking you because of Samson. We've got to put a stop to Samson. We won't attack you anymore if you'll give us Samson. And so the text says 3,000 Israelites surround Samson. And they say to him, Don't you know that we serve the Philistines, that we are subservient to the Philistines? You're causing us all kinds of trouble. The Israelites, at this time, they had been under the oppression of the Philistines for 40 years now, and they didn't want to cause any problems with the Philistines any more than they had already. And so they say to Samson, these 3,000 Israelites, Samson, we're going to arrest you. We're going to tie you with a rope, and we're going to deliver you to the Philistines. Will you let us do that, Samson? And Samson says, on one condition, I'll let you deliver me to the Philistines as long as you don't try to kill me in the process. And so he didn't want to have to kill them. And so they agree, okay. And so the Israelites, they deliver Samson to the Philistines, and then they leave. Well, Samson is now in the middle of all of the Philistines, and the Philistines, they don't know what's coming. Samson breaks the ropes that he's been tied with. He finds the fresh jawbone of a donkey, and he kills with that jawbone, single-handedly, 1,000 Philistines. This is a one-man army. There's nothing natural about him and his strength. The Philistines, they just can't figure out why Samson is so strong. When you think of Samson, don't think of Samson as having this Arnold Schwarzenegger physique. Because if you look at Arnold Schwarzenegger, at least the pictures of him in the past, and you know exactly where his strength comes from. It's for his muscles. He's been training. He's just got this incredible build to him. But Samson, you can't tell this by looking at Samson. You don't know where his strength comes from. He's just a normal-looking man. And you could just picture what the Philistines are asking. Maybe he's taking some sort of pill. Maybe he's doping. Maybe he's eating his Wheaties. Maybe he's drinking from some sort of special spring. And so they don't know the answer. And so they set out to figure out where he's getting his strength. We come to chapter 16. When we come to chapter 16, Samson has aged a few years. One day he goes to Gaza, which is Philistine territory. He likes hanging out with the Philistines, and he sees a prostitute. Remember, he's got a thing for pagan women, and he enlists her services. The men of the city find out that Samson is there. They surround the house that he's in, the house of the prostitute, and they lock down the city. They shut the gates, the giant gates to the city to contain him, and they lie in wait outside the house to kill him. And so Samson, he's in the house. He's just kind of loafing around until midnight. He wakes up. He strolls up to the city gates. He picks up the gate, the support reams and the rods holding it to the ground in all, and he carries the gate to Mount Hebron as if just to mock them. The Philistines, they can't stop this man. There's nothing they can do. Now Samson then meets a woman by the name of Delilah. And Samson falls for her in no time. She's a wicked woman, a pagan woman, cold as ice. She doesn't have a heart, and she plays Samson like a song. He meant absolutely nothing to her, but she meant absolutely everything to him. And so the Philistines, they're watching this play out, and they come to Delilah, and they ask her, find out for us what makes him so strong. And if you do that, each one of us will give you 1,000 pieces of silver. And of course, she liked money a lot more than she liked Samson. And so she goes to Samson and says, hey, handsome, what makes you so strong? He says, well, if I'm tied with 7 new bowstrings, I'll become as weak as any normal man. And so the Philistines, they come in and they bind him, and he snaps those bowstrings like they're nothing. And so she comes back to him and says, oh, Samson, tell me about your strength. And he says, well, if I'm bound by 7 new ropes, then I'll become weak. Well, then that happens, and he breaks them like they're nothing. And well, Delilah comes back to him a third time saying, why won't you tell me? How long are you going to play me like this? And he answers, well, if my hair is woven like a web into 7 locks and braced by a pen, then I'll become weak. Well, that happens again, and he's just as strong as ever. And so she comes to him a 4th time, and she plays the love card. Oh, you say you love me. Why won't you tell me? You must not really love me. You know, she's a sorry hypocrite. She's just an actress, and he's gullible, at least for her. She breaks her. This is what he says. If someone cuts my hair, I'll be weak again. I'm under this Nazirite vow. If a razor cuts my hair, I'll be like other men. And so that very night, she makes him fall asleep on his knees. The Philistines come in, and a man gently, ever so gently, shaves his head while he's sleeping. And Delilah then wakes him up. And the Bible says in verse 19 that she torments him. He thinks he can defeat the Philistines, but he can't overcome them at that time. It only takes a couple men to take him. And then they damage his eyes, permanently blinding him. The Philistines, they put him in shackles and place him in a mill where he's going to grind wheat. And this goes on for a while. He's a sorry, pathetic prisoner. He becomes this sort of trophy. And the Bible says that God allowed his hair to continue to grow. The hair, of course, was nothing. The hair didn't do anything to Samson. It was God who chose to give him his strength to begin with. Now, okay, fast forward. One day there's this grand feast of the Philistines. The Philistines have come together to offer worship for their god Dagon. And they say in this big worship assembly, bring Samson out that he might entertain us. And so they make him stand between 2 pillars. The 2 pillars, incidentally, are supporting the whole massive building containing all of the Philistines right now. And he places his hands on the pillars and he prays to God that just this one last time God would allow him to avenge the Philistines. He knows he's the judge of Israel. There is also, though, selfishness. He wants to just get back at the Philistines, but he knows that he can still do one thing for the Lord. And so God gives him strength just this one last time. He presses on the pillars. He makes them collapse. And somehow the whole building collapses and kills all the Philistines present, including Samson. He dies in the process. And that's the story of Samson. 5 lessons. Draw 5 lessons with me. These are important lessons, I think. And so I hope you'll pay attention. 5 life lessons. Number 1. Parents who fail to say no to their children. They're making debts which will one day have to be paid by someone with interest. Parents who fail to say no to their children are making debts which will one day have to be paid by someone with interest. I think about his father, Manoah. Was his father just too old? Was his father just spineless? I don't know the answer, but I did hear someone say recently, you either spoil your children and you raise your grandchildren, or you raise your children and spoil your grandchildren. And I think there's some truth there, if we will be honest enough to listen to it. There was very little to recommend us to Samson. Think about all of his failures. He was self-willed, obstinate, rebellious. He refused to listen to the wise counsel of his parents. He chose evil friends. He gambled. He courted temptation. He committed fornication. He gave up, surrendered, and forfeited his source of strength. He became disloyal to his own vow. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1 says this, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, for this is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Now I want you to think about Ephesians 6:1, which we just read. Consider that even though this is written to children, children, at least in their youngest years, they can't understand that verse. You don't wait until children understand that verse to start teaching them that verse. And so Ephesians 6:1 is actually written to parents, because you start teaching them this principle from day one. Ephesians 6 is both long-term and short-term. Honor your father and mother. This is a lifelong command, not just while kids are under your roof. This applies to parents just as much as it applies to children. You might be old enough, you might say, to your child, your grown child. You might one day be old enough to drink, to do drugs, to fornicate, to curse, to engage in shady business, to watch filth. But Jesus is always going to live in our house. You will not do these things under my roof on my dime. Or you might say to them, you can come visit me, but don't expect me to miss church services while you're visiting. It's a reminder that parents are parents for life. And they are to communicate to their children as long as they have a house for their children to visit them. Wickedness is not welcome here. One of the most memorable things about Samson is his utter lack of self-restraint. He's the poster child of sowing your wild oats. What gave him this sense of no accountability? A man is first taught restraint by his parents. And then, as he ages, hopefully he's taught restraint by what he will listen to from God. But if neither his parents or God works, then society's going to teach him restraint. You look at Samson, and Samson let none of these things restrain him. Here's the second lesson. Beauty or brawn will destroy a person without morality. Beauty or brawn will destroy a person who has no morality. You know, Samson, he's one of the S's. You know what I mean by that? Some people are just distinguished by an outstanding characteristic. The strongest, the prettiest, the smartest, the kindest. Samson is one of those S's. And we need to be reminded that it is possible to squander the very gifts God has given you to live out his purpose for your life. Failure to use the gifts that God has given you for his glory, it's going to carry a very high price tag. Samson's strength became his very undoing. He didn't use his God-given gift for God alone. He used his God-given gift for his own desires. I think about how might all of this have read differently had Samson been a righteous man, firmly dedicated to doing God's will. See, your greatest strength can ultimately end up being your greatest weakness. You think about a man with financial blessings who has no moral or spiritual moorings, it's going to turn him into a thief. You think about a man with a good family name, but that man lacks moral or spiritual values. It's going to turn that man into a lazy slouch. You think about a woman with physical beauty, but without moral strength. It's going to turn her into a loose woman. You see, the true measure of a man is not found in his physical strength or his appearance, but in his character. The third lesson that we can learn from this is this: a mistake is a terrible thing to waste. The third lesson is this: a mistake is a terrible thing to waste. Samson just had a really bad memory. He's forever the poster child of choosing wrong women. You ever know a man or a woman with that problem? They're just like Samson. His first marriage was to a Philistine woman, against his parents' wishes, by the way, who betrayed him by sharing the secret to his lion honeycomb riddle. And then you have a second marriage to another Philistine woman, Delilah, who appeared to be a prostitute herself, and she shamelessly used the word love when talking to Samson, and she was more than happy to betray him if the price was right. Apparently, by the way, his parents had given up on him by the time he found Delilah, because there's no record of an objection to this second marriage. Samson paid the price for that as well. The lesson is, be careful who you marry. Learn from Samson's mistakes. Don't marry a Samson. Don't marry a Delilah. Sometimes a Christian might fall in love with a non-Christian and say to himself or herself, it doesn't really matter if this person is a member of the church. I love him and he's a good guy. That might be. And it might be that he might one day obey the gospel and become a preacher or an elder in the church. And sometimes that happens. But you need to be warned about this. Samson believed he would have a good future with Delilah. He believed that in choosing a mate, there were some fundamental spiritual things that really weren't necessary to have a faithful, loving companion. And Samson, he repeated his first mistake by marrying the enemy again. And that's why the story goes from sad to tragic. Samson refused to learn from his mistakes. When you pray to the Lord, don't just pray, God, please forgive me of my sins. Don't stop there. Add this, and help me learn from my mistakes so I could do better. The fourth lesson that we can learn from this text is this. We need to be reminded that a woman can sometimes do something that men cannot do. A woman can sometimes do what men cannot do. I want you to look back at these 4 chapters and ask yourself, what man in Samson's life did he respect? What men in Samson's life did he revere? Did he respect his dad? Did he respect the elders of the city? Did he respect the king of the Philistines? Who did he respect? The answer is none of them. He didn't respect any man in his life. When we speak of superhuman strength in the Judges, you always think about Samson. But I want you to appreciate the fact that Delilah, she was stronger than even him. The elders of the city plan in mind, ultimately, to destroy Samson. And it didn't involve weaponry. It didn't involve numbers. It didn't involve a huge military. It involved only one woman. And they were willing to pay her a very high price to use her powers. The Bible teaches us that a wife is to be subject to her husband. And the Bible teaches us that men are to be leaders of the church. But no one can deny the powerful influence that a woman wields. And the Bible is full of examples of women using their power for ill. Think about just some of the examples with me. You think about Eve persuading her husband to eat that fruit. He knew it was wrong all along, but he did it because of her power. You think about Potiphar's wife, through deception, got her husband to imprison an innocent man in order to cover up her infidelity. You think about Sarah, impatiently suggesting to Abraham that he commit adultery with Hagar, her handmaid, a surrogate mother. And believe it or not, he actually did it. And then you have the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, which continues to this day between Israel and Islam. You have Solomon's wives. They, 1 Kings chapter 11 says, they turned his heart away after foreign gods. Or you think about the wicked influence of Jezebel. She convinced her husband to sell himself to do evil in the sight of the Lord. 1 Kings chapter 21. Or you think about Matthew chapter 14. You read about Herodias, who wanted John the Baptist dead. And she shrewdly used her daughter to influence her husband Herod to behead the prophet. Delilah, she openly toyed with Samson. She used his heart, but she was his enemy. She was a great, convincing actress, and she preyed on his weaknesses. And we all have weaknesses. James chapter 1 verse 14 says, each person, you and me, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Don't think you don't have weaknesses. You do. The devil is a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 8. Do you suppose that Satan very carefully placed Delilah in Samson's life at just the right time? The question for you ladies is, what is your influence over the man in your life? Some women help them to be wicked before their God. Other women help them to be pleasing to God. Here's the last lesson. Number 5. God is the Father of second chances. I want you to learn this from this text. God is the Father of second chances. Look back at Samson's life. Wouldn't it be great if Samson had the chance to look at his future on that very day that he went to his parents and said, give me this woman from Timnah. But you and I can. You and I can look at his eyes. We can see how his eyes were gouged out in anger. We can see the shame that he would one day experience. We can see him in suicide. And if he could have seen what we can see now, do you think that he would have done these things? I don't know, but before he died, Samson reached out to the Lord. However, he did it when it was too late to salvage much of anything for the glory of God. But you and I don't have to make the same mistake he did. If we recognize the presence of evil in our lives now is the time to deal with it. I know we find Samson in Hebrews chapter 11. Samson is in that chapter, that roll call of faith. And the author of Hebrews asks us to look at Samson as an example of faith. And you look at Samson in Hebrews chapter 11 and you think, how can that be? He committed suicide. How can he be an example of faith? Well, apparently, the fact that he was God's instrument against the Philistines made this death of his a military duty, despite the fact that he did it somewhat out of a personal grudge to the Philistines. It was at that moment that he became a judge for Israel. I think about his prayer in Judges chapter 16, verse 28. Was it a sincere prayer? Wayne Jackson points out that Samson in that prayer employs 3 names for God. Verse 28. Then Samson called out to the Lord and said, O Lord God. The word he used was Yahweh. It's rendered Jehovah sometimes. He says, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God. He designates God as Adonai, or Lord, which emphasizes the sovereignty that God has over man. And then he says, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines from my 2 eyes. That last word he uses, Elohim, hints of the strength and power of deity. It could be that he is sincere. But in all of this, I want you to remind yourself to never say, I've done so much wrong. There's no sense in me becoming a Christian now. My Lord, in Matthew chapter 20, he gave the parable of the manager who hires workers in the field over the course of the day. And it says in verse 7, he hired some at the very last hour of the workday, and even the 11th hour, and they received the same payment as those who agreed to work from the very beginning of the workday. There's a lesson in there. Even though you might feel like a failure, even though you might feel like you have lived your best days not for God but for yourself and have squandered them, learn this lesson. You can still be saved. God is the God of second chances. Of course, even with forgiveness, there are always going to be consequences for disobedience. Samson's story goes from sad to tragic when Samson doesn't learn from his mistakes. He repeats the same bad mistake of entering into a relationship with another woman, and the loss of his eyes was real, and it was permanent until he woke up one day in paradise. I want to conclude by reminding us of what Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 says. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap. That's the summary of Samson's lessons for us. God is going to accomplish his will with or without us. God doesn't need us. We can be rebelling against God just as Samson was all along. And God's still going to use us for his glory. We get to choose whether or not we will benefit from that. I look at Samson's birth, and God only began to deliver Israel through Samson and the judges. Much later, he would use a young shepherd boy who would sling a stone deep into the forehead of a Philistine spokesman named Goliath. And that man, that boy, he would eventually lead God's people to complete victory over the Philistines. And then through one of David's descendants, would he lead God's people through complete victory over God's enemies. The question for you is, what do you learn from Samson? Do you learn his lessons? Are you determined to not make the same mistakes that God, in his inspiration, preserved for us to learn? The question is, are you walking in the light as he is in the light? Can you be a better Christian? Can you be a better child, a daughter, a son, a better father, a better mother, a better husband, a better wife, a better leader in the church? And can we help you do that? If you haven't become a Christian, you can't be a Christian parent, a Christian spouse, unless you're a Christian. You need to become a Christian. Repent of your sins. Be immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins. If you're subject in any way, walk down this aisle right now as we stand and sing.